Okay, great. Oh, oh, I've gone on already. So yeah, so hi, my name is Pegs, and it is really an honor to be here. I currently work on employability policy nationally, with a particular lens on the third sector. And when I say nationally, I mean in Scotland. And I know we've got people from across the UK here, so I should just be really clear about that. Prior to taking on this role, I worked on a number of employability projects in Fife, strategic projects, and they were informed, latterly particularly, by the principles of human learning systems. So that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. A little bit about what human learning systems is or isn't, and what we learned on our journey with that, and co-production and service design, and how these things all kind of link together. I think the thing I really want to say is I'm absolutely not an expert. I am one of many people who are finding their way with this, and just here to share stuff that we learned, and hopefully it will be useful to you all too. But before we start, it would be really helpful to understand where you are or how you feel about on this journey, on the journey with this thing called human learning systems. So hopefully you can all see this pirate ship. I need to take down my screen so I can actually see you all, which now I can't. So I might rely on Abby to be able to see the chat actually, because it seems like while I'm sharing my screen, I can't get access to that. So yeah, so I love this image. It's just welcome to those of you that are coming in. Oh, I think we've got quite a lot of people suddenly coming in. Every time I do that, it clicks us on a screen. So this is just a really nice image for working out where we feel we might be around this thing called human learning systems. So it might be that you feel like you are up at the top of the ship, flying the flag, or it might be that you are feeling slightly nauseous over the side of the ship, like this is really rocking my world. I don't quite understand what this is all about. It might be that it's passed you by entirely. You feel like you're a 20 sitting reading under the palm tree. Or maybe you're even trying to resist it and push it back. So just thought it'd be nice if you could pop in the chat, if you haven't done so already, your name, and then this time maybe add the number that sort of most connects with where you are. And I'm going to see if I can try and re-find you all on my system. But I can't. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Oh, that's really weird. I completely can't find a way of seeing you while I've got my screen share on. Okay. Abby, can you tell me, have we got any numbers appearing in the chat?
We have a few. Yes, we are seeing. Oh, I'm not sure if I'm seeing seeing numbers for people in the chat. We're seeing 2, we're seeing 12, I'm seeing 18, 9, 5, all over the place. Numbers all over the place.
Brilliant. So some of you climbing up the rigging, some of you sort of right at the front, showing us where we're going, and a few maybe running to catch up and try and kind of see what this thing is all about. Maybe join the boat. So that's great, and you are absolutely welcome no matter where you are on this journey. For those of you that are really familiar with it, I'm not going to apologize, but I am going to do a bit of a run through over what it is, just to help with those that are less familiar. But I see people are still arriving, so I think, because I can't see you, I find it very hard to ask people to kind of chip in and unmute or whatever. So when it comes to the questions bit, I will pop down my slides and hopefully he will reappear. Yeah, in terms of the session, a quick overview of what human learning systems is, but critically a bit of a connection with how that links to the concepts of service design and co-production, because for me, I think sometimes we can see these things as sort of being separate different models, but actually they all interlink. And then a little bit about what happens when theory meets reality, in terms of our journey in Fife. And that story, that journey is all about an engagement around this thing called employability. So I guess maybe it would be useful if I say what employability is. For those that aren't familiar, employability is kind of a public sector investment, quite often, in supporting people who are furthest from the labour market and helping them get into jobs. At its simplest, that is what employability is about. There's an entire sector, and in Scotland, hundreds of millions of pounds get spent on it every year, and across the UK, we're moving into the billions. It is an industry. So this is important to know when we come to talk about why human learning systems matters. And then also I'll talk a little bit about, was it worth it, what we learned and what changed. We will pause for questions at various points on the journey. I will hopefully be able to see you at that point. But also feel free to pop questions in the chat if you're like me and you like to just get things out of your head. And we'll just go back and check through that, hopefully with a bit of help from Abby when that comes. Okay. So if it's okay, I'll just click that. Without further ado, we'll dive into this thing called human learning systems. So for me, this cartoon was actually my starting point with, it was the thing that really kind of got me fired up when it came to human learning systems. I stumbled across a webinar. I thought it looked a bit interesting. And then during the presentation, the speaker shared this cartoon. And it was like somebody had drawn what was in my head. Because the world of employability is very much funded along the lines of the if A then B model that you see inside the box. You know, we take person A, we input CV, we input interview skills, we input maybe a bit of confidence building, some work experience, and out pops B, an employable person, and they get a job. And that sort of linear mentality then drove how services are funded, and still does in many contexts, and delivered. So in a lot of employability contexts, we see a payment model where you would get paid for the numbers of people you worked with and the numbers of people who got jobs at the end. I call it numbers in, numbers out. I think the more official term is new public management, as a model for making sure that we get value for money in our public services. And really, for me, the new public management model feels like you've kind of taken something that works for a factory that's making baked beans and applied it to kind of something which is really complex and messy. So, you know, makes sense with a factory of baked beans. You count your inputs, you count your outputs, you try and make sure you've got value for money in between, and that's your measure of success. But when it came to employability, anybody that was working in the sector it felt like was looking outside the box and kind of going, hang on a minute, this feels a lot more squiggly. Most people's journeys to work do not follow this beautiful linear journey. It goes round about the houses, in and out, up and down. They may get a job, leave a job, and so on. And there's lots of things that are going on which are impacting on that. But the new public management model is very attractive. From a governance perspective, it means we can very easily say, we've spent money X, we've got output Y, aren't we doing well? And the thing about the human learning systems model, which was very attractive to me, is that it begins to give us a governance model which allows us to have a slightly more curious, interrogative, and realistic relationship with what's actually happening on the ground, and really to engage with those squiggles outside. So I'm going to endeavour to show you a little diagram, a little video clip, which kind of summarizes this for me, and then I'll dive into a little bit more in depth. So again, because I can't see people, I'm hoping this is going to work. We've turned the volume down because it's a bit rubbish, music, but Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. Oh, thank goodness, I can see you all now. Um, I'm just interested to know, just see if people can give me electronic hands. Like, does that resonate with any of you? Because for me, even though I work in the field of employability and that's about homelessness, it seemed to me to kind of capture some of the challenges that we have in the landscape of employability, and the need to kind of shift to a slightly different way of working. Yeah, I'm getting some thumbs up and some hands up. Okay, well that's reassuring. So I'm not the only one. Okay, so I'm going to dial in a little bit more into the human learning and systems elements. Oh, lots of thumbs up from someone. Thank you, Sarah. And yeah, and then talk a little bit more about that. So bear with me. I will start sharing my screen again. Now I need to find you all again to be able to do that. Right, come on, share screen. There we go. Okay. Okay. So human learning systems. So first of all, a little bit about human learning systems as a collaborative. So there is a kind of core collaborative of individuals and organizations who have kind of been working together for several years now and come to an understanding of this sort of the value of this new way of working. And so they are the Human Learning Systems Collaborative. But there's also a wider community of members who can sign up to mailings and so on. And hopefully Abby will pop the link in the chat at the end or even now for people to sign up. But the general focus, the agreed kind of shared vision here is that we're trying to promote a different approach to public management, something which actually responds to the strengths and the needs of the people that we serve and is really rooted in the practical realities of people's lives, and the complexity that they bring, rather than trying to kind of put things into lovely linear models and boxes. So the human in human learning systems, there's a really foundational principle here, which is that all public services are about respecting and enabling human flourishing and human freedoms, and that each individual is at the center of their own interconnected and interdependent system. They are the center of their knowledge, their insights and strengths, and we prioritize that in everything that we're doing, whether it's strategic planning, organizational planning, or frontline services. And when we work in this way, what we do changes, what we prioritize changes. It becomes less about what we do and a lot more about how we show up as humans alongside each other. So we start focusing on things like qualities like authenticity and empathy, or the importance of growing trust, because we are humans interconnecting with other humans, and without those things, it can be very, very hard to work together. And crucially for me, this isn't just about thinking about the people that we are here to support as humans. It's actually also about seeing our staff, our leaders as humans, and allowing them to show up with their vulnerabilities, their struggles, and their travails as well. So this isn't just out there human relationship. This is an all of us, a collective responsibility to start working in different ways. And I think this is really important. I actually met with a colleague just a few weeks ago, working in another public sector department, and they were saying, "Oh, Pegs, it's just a nightmare. I just had this realization that it's all comes down to people and relationships, and that can change at the drop of a hat, you know. So how do we ever resolve anything?" But actually, for me, I would flip it and say, it's amazing. It's all about relationships. And as soon as we are open and honest and realistic about that, then we start thinking differently about who we are and how we show up. We start focusing on building qualities of authenticity, empathy, and trust within our leadership, within our organizations, so that we can all work together. And this lovely quote from, I think possibly now the former Director of Public Service Reform at Gateshead Council, but what this allows is that even when we get things wrong, the humanity of it helps. We're all in it together. So I'm going to leap to the systems part of the process now, because I think this is kind of the next most important bit. So So the Human Learning Systems model understands that we are all systems. So as a human, I am a physiological system or set of systems. I have a nervous system, a skeletal system, a circulatory system, and so on. And then as a human being in this world, I am, as this diagram shows, affected by a whole load of actors and factors which create the system in which I operate. There's me as an individual, there's my family and friends, there's my neighborhood and community, there's how much money I have available, whether I have a job and skills. These are all the actors and factors which will be impacting on me in my life as I move forward. And these systems operate at different scales. So we can apply a systems model at a cellular scale, at an individual scale, organizational, and all the way up to strategic, which is the bit that I'm going to talk about later today. I think a really important thing I want to say about systems mapping and images like this is that we should always understand that when we're trying to draw out and understand a system, it is the map and not the mountain. I have a husband who's a mountain climber, so this is why this is a useful analogy for me. But we mustn't confuse the map for the mountain. It's a useful guide to help us understand what's going on, but it is not the reality of everybody's lives or the problem that we're trying to solve. It is just a guide. So when we are working in a systems way, we understand that the quality of the relationships between the different parts of the system are really, really critical. We focus on cultivating trust, and we build learning into the system, which I'll come on to in a minute. Also, healthy systems are diverse and address inequalities of power. So, for example, you could have a pine plantation with just one tree, and it might last for a few hundred years, but it's not going to be particularly healthy and it won't last forever. You could have a very diverse and complex woodland with loads of different trees and animals and insects and lichens and mosses and mycelium and all those things which create a healthy system which could last for thousands of years. And that healthy system, the mycelium, which is maybe one of the smallest parts, is as important as the largest oak tree. So a healthy system values all parts equally and is very varied and diverse. And the other thing which is really interesting about systems is that understanding things is that we might think about systems stewardship or systems convening as a role which can be central to supporting healthy systems in our world. So a systems steward would maybe, in my world, we might have contract managers in employability, but if we move towards a systems stewardship role, you would move from kind of checking the performance of providers and saying, oh, you're doing well, you get more money, you're doing less well, you get less money, to understanding what the blockers and challenges are for each of those parts. Maybe the organization that's doing very well is actually working with the people who are easiest to support into work, and the organization which has got less good outcomes is affected by other barriers within the system, such as lack of healthcare, childcare, or transport. So a system steward would have a very different approach. And healthy systems focus on and structure in learning as a priority. And this is because a system is never the sum of its parts. It is the product of that interaction. A healthy system doesn't say, that's your job over there, I'm not going to deal with that. If you've got a problem, tough. Or get involved in blaming, well, your bit over there hasn't worked well, so it's all your fault that this isn't working. A healthy system is curious. A healthy system tries to understand what is going on in different parts of the complexity of the system and work out how to make things better. And that means that from the strategic level right down to the front line, we practice consistent and ongoing curiosity and openness to different information. And that's where this emergent learning comes through, and almost an intentional, definitely an intentional approach to iterative experimentation and test and learn. Crucially, sometimes people think that when we go from new public management, and what I talk about is numbers in, numbers out, we're saying data isn't important, but that's absolutely not the case. In a human learning systems model, data is incredibly important, but we value it for what we can learn from it rather than as evidence of success or failure. Finally, in terms of learning, we focus rather on replicating and scaling up. We focus on how we can increase creative possibility within the system. So that might be sharing learning, but inspiring others to do things differently that's relevant to their context. And obviously, we embrace mistakes as learning opportunities. This has become a bit of a mantra now. and nonetheless very, very difficult to do, and increasingly difficult to do the higher up the leadership chain you get. But we mustn't forget that mistakes are critical to our learning and to our improving. And if we don't ever admit, turn towards and acknowledge our mistakes, we will keep failing the people we're here to serve. So what does this look like as a model? So try not to be overwhelmed if you've not seen this before. Again, a map, not the mountain. But this is the Human Learning Systems learning cycle. So I don't know if my mouse will show up on the screen here, but we start with a purpose, a kind of shared understanding of what is the problem we're trying to solve, what is the thing that we want to achieve together. And then we spend quite a bit of time understanding the system that we're trying to work within. And that involves building relationships, exploring challenges, drawing out what's going on already and making the system visible to all those who are getting involved in trying to make things different. You then move on to planning some things that you might want to do to change and make things better to achieve your purpose. And then you start experimenting and exploring. And there is a continual reflect and learn cycle. From there, you would move to working out what worked and feed that back into the system. So it becomes part of the system and not an add-on. I'll never forget talking to someone in public services. They were like, well, what's going to happen at the end of this project? How are you going to mainstream it? And I said, well, my world, mainstreaming means we become part of the system, not that we sort ourselves out and just exist over there. We become part of the public service system. So what does that look like and how do we work around that? And then in the middle, you've got this system stewardship function, sort of helping all the parts share the learning and work together. And this can happen at multiple levels. So we can have human learning systems happening at the strategic level, like I'm going to talk about later, but it can also work at an organizational or project level, and it can also work in the frontline relationship between a worker and the person they're there to support. The worker can work with the individual to understand their purpose, what's the system and context within which they're working, co-design things they want to try as solutions to whatever problems they're facing, experiment and explore, and then see what works and carry on. So much more experimental and curious approach to our relationships on the front line as well as strategically. So this is the service design double diamond. And again, if I could see you, I would ask if anybody was familiar with it. I think, so this has come, the service design double diamond model came from the Research Design Council as a kind of way of expressing, if you were doing product design, how important it is to spend time understanding a problem, the problem we're trying to solve, before we start designing the product or the solution. It is really, really relevant in public service contexts, especially, I think, because most of us who work in public service contexts, and I include third sector organizations within that language, we're quite strong fixers, or certainly that's my experience. We like to help solve problems. And quite often what we do is we might start with the kind of the pointy end of diamond number one, where we're like, oh, we've noticed there's an issue here. And we kind of leap straight into diamond number two and start focusing on, well, how are we going to solve that? And we don't really like to spend time in that kind of messy place where we try to understand what the problem is, maybe unpick some of our assumptions about it and see what it looks like from other perspectives. So emphasizing the importance of taking time to understand the problem is really important of service design and getting things right, I think, in the public sector. From a human learning systems perspective, the purpose is the kind of the bit of the design model where you're like, what are we going to try and change? And then for me, the understanding the problem is happening really here, where we're understanding the system. And obviously, we're going to get more insight into the problem when we start doing experimentation and exploration. But really, that's what's going on there. Okay. And I'm going to add my beautiful, very scribbly arrow, but basically what we've got here is a loop back. So if you're doing a service design double diamond model, you don't just end once you've designed the solution in public services, you loop back and continue to refine and revisit your insight and understanding. The Scottish approach to service design is has got an extra layer to it, if you like. And it really comes from the Christie Commission back in 2011, where there was a commitment that people of Scotland should be involved in designing and defining the problems and designing and supporting the delivery of their public services. And that is the vision for the Scottish approach to service design. So really, we're engaging people who are affected by a problem right at the get-go when we're trying to understand it. And for me, it's just a total no-brainer that you would take, if you're trying to understand a problem, of course you'd want to be talking to, engaging and working alongside the people who are most affected by the problem. And it is hard to believe that this isn't business as usual, but at the moment it isn't. So that's part of something that I am passionate about trying to change. Co-production then connects with this, because co-production is a means of doing that citizen engagement. So the Scottish Co-production Network has this definition, which I really like. Co-production is an intention to rebalance power. That connects with our human learning systems, equalizing systems, and combine everyone's strengths, connects to the human flourishing element, so that we can work together to achieve positive change, which for me connects to that continuous improvement cycle. And again, just as with human learning systems, co-production can happen at different scales, from the strategic boardroom right down to one-to-one relationships and how those happen. So that is a rattle through of human learning systems, the theory, but also how it connects to service design, in particular Scottish approach to service design, and this concept called co-production. So I'm going to pause for questions now. I'm going to stop sharing, and hopefully you're all going to reappear. And maybe there might be some questions in the chat, or if people have any questions they would like to ask, please just pop your hand up. Really interested to hear from people if that resonates, if you already knew it all, or if anything that was in there was of interest or new. No questions? Okay, is it making sense so far? Yeah, it's really hard when you can't see everybody when you're sharing the screens. So yeah, okay, I've got a little thumbs up here and a couple of comments in the chat. So yeah, so good. The connections I'm making are making sense. That's helpful. As a voluntary centre, how do I influence the decision makers to adopt this? I will come on to that in the next bit, Rose. So no problem at all. And yes, also the blockers and barriers when it comes to selling the value of human learning systems, Helen, lots. And again, I can talk about our experience there. Karen, I agree. The visual model is quite challenging. It does feel quite complicated. In some ways, that simpler model where it shows that it can work at different scales is quite helpful. But again, it's just a map. It's not the mountain. So just kind of, find a way of representing that works for you and that you feel will be useful in your context. I'm kind of a bit free and easy with these things. I think just find what works. I think that's probably a bit based on our experience. Okay. Any other questions or comments, or shall I dive on into what that looked like in reality? Yeah. Okay. It's very hard. Yeah. See, just check the page 2. No. Okay. Right. So I'm gonna share my screen again. You are all going to vanish, and I will start talking about when theory meets reality. So before I dive into the experience of work in Fife, I just want to give a little bit of context about employability policy in Scotland, because it is relevant. So, so basically about 6 years ago, we had multiple employability services were funded through multiple funding streams, some UK, some Scottish government, some local authority, some through different arm's length organisations, some with payment by outcome. And also services were delivered on generally using a model of a 5-stage pipeline, which really does reinforce that language of being kind of the baked bean factory kind of approach to employability. So your 5-stage pipeline was early engagement, someone's unemployable, move them through each of the stages, and ta-da, at the end, you've got somebody who's in work and employed and getting some support maybe to stay there. And it was a beautiful linear journey. But around 2018, the Scottish Government published something called the No One Left Behind Review of Employability. And that was a really important document because the researchers that were behind it were able to sort of demonstrate that most people's journey to work, for those furthest from the labour market, the people that the government wants to help with its money, their journey to work was not linear. It didn't follow this beautiful 5-stage pipeline. It involved multiple interventions, multiple engagements, some of them nothing to do with employability, and a lot of different things work for different people at different points. They also realised that the kind of, particularly the national model of commissioning with large regions, meant that there wasn't enough flexibility to the local economy and the local employability market. And so they needed, different things would be needed differently in different areas. And the demographics of unemployment would be different in different areas. One area you might have very high youth unemployment. Another area, it's more about older people, or a big influx of refugees have come in, and so on. So basically, this messy, complex commissioning framework, or set of frameworks that were in place, and the payment models were really not ensuring the money was reaching the people it was intended to support, and they weren't getting support in a way which actually was meaningfully going to help them into work. And that's not to say it wasn't working. It has been working. It's just not maybe working as well as it could, and for the people that most need it. So the new No One Left Behind policy was going to be one pot of money from Scottish Government for all employability provision. There has been some slight tweaks to that, but broadly that was the principle. And budgets and decision making would be devolved to local authorities, and that they would work with partners through local employability partnerships to plan how to spend that money most usefully for their local context. And critically, they wanted this new approach to be guided by the No One Left Behind principles. And you can probably see how these connect with some of the things that we've been talking about in human learning systems. So the focus on dignity and respect, so human flourishing, equality, and also this continuous improvement mindset. That they would be informed by data, including the experience of service users, and that there would be a kind of more of an approach to the right job at the right time for the individual, rather than any job which would fit the service's need. So, as it happened, we had in Fife just completed a large-scale review of mental health and employment services and how they interconnected. And we had used, without knowing it, and this is why I think I don't get too hung up on the language and the models, without knowing it, we had used co-production principles and service design methodology in that journey. We'd spent 18 months doing it, and we had learned quite a lot, and it had developed recommendations and changes to the system that we wouldn't have had if we hadn't have taken that approach. Which comes to my point about how do you get permission to do this? Well, when we were doing that piece of work, lots of people thought we were a bit mad, but we did it anyway. And then we kind of did it through proving the value of what could change and what could be different. And it was at the end of that journey that I came across Human Learning Systems and had this kind of amazing light bulb moment of like, look, I'm not alone. And there's a model that can help us work in this new way. So I got very excited, and I went to one of our local partnership board meetings and started talking about human learning systems and No One Left Behind, and how it could all connect up and we could work in this new different way, and has anybody read this report and watched this video clip? And it's all very exciting. And I think it was the then head of education who looked at me, and she sort of said something along the lines of, "Oh, Pegs, you're just too clever for me. I don't understand what you're even talking about," which is ludicrous because she is a highly intelligent person, yeah, just is. And I realized at that moment that not everybody had the headspace and the time to take on all the theory and all the kind of methodology and that complicated diagram. Like, it was just too much. And so I kind of reined my head in a little bit. And that kind of brings me to what I would say is lesson number 1 for me. And that is just start where you are and do what you can. Don't try and get everybody on board, evidence what works, and then people will come on board naturally find an opportunity to start working in this way. It could be very small, it could be a project. It doesn't have to be a big strategic review. So the quote actually comes from somebody who was involved in leading the violence reduction unit work in Glasgow. So I've totally nabbed it. But for me, it has been and continues to be a foundational guiding motto. Sometimes we can be so overwhelmed trying to change the whole system of everything that's not working, or feeling like we need to take this whole model and apply it wholeheartedly or it won't work. And it can sort of paralyze us. So yeah, if you take nothing else from this is a good motto to take. Okay. So yeah, we were building on something when we started doing this piece of work. We had already evidenced things that could work, and yet still the human learning systems part of what we did, that was my foundation. It was in my head. I knew that I was thinking in this way, but actually I didn't need to make that visible, I realized, to everybody else, because actually it was going to put them off and create more barriers. I'd only just got them into the whole thing of co-production. So when we're engaging in any change journey, we need to build our core team. Yeah, you can't do it alone. And again, for those of you that were thinking about how do we make change, find your allies, find people who are interested in the same problem that you have, and who want to get on board with testing and developing and working differently. So for us, to build our core team, we needed to ask two questions. Who are the people most interested in or affected by employability services in Fife? And who would be interested in doing things differently and supporting a collaborative learning approach together? So of course, within that, you've got your usual providers, your employability providers, your Department for Work and Pensions, the council, education, but critically, people who are using services or who might want to use services or who had used services, people who are affected by our employability services. And they generally, in my experience, don't end up on people's projects' core teams. But for me, that is foundational, and I'll say why in a moment. So this is why. Because what we'd learned on our work on mental health and employability is that having people affected by the problem you're trying to solve on your steering group is one of the most valuable things you can do. The world looks very different depending on where you sit. And even as a provider who's worked with hundreds and thousands of people over the years, you will still never, unless you've been in that user position, fully understand what it feels like to be on the other side of that divide. And having those voices and perspectives in the room mean you are much more likely to ask the right questions, solve the right problem, and move forward in just, maybe it might seem subtle, but that subtle shift is kind of a bit like train tracks. If you take a tiny shift at the starting point of a train track, you can end up in a very different place. And I feel like that about that early collaboration with service users. So to do that, we asked some of the providers that were coming to bring along, to find a volunteer or someone they were working with who would be willing to volunteer. And it needed to be someone who might get something out of the process, somebody who was going to actually find it interesting and wanted to make a difference. And also somebody that was going to feel kind of comfortable enough to be in those spaces with support. And luckily, we had some former volunteers with us from the previous work on mental health and employability. So I think that helped as well in that original meeting. And it's not just important for us and our projects. This early engagement is important because when we make decisions on behalf of other people, we assume we understand their dreams, needs, experience, and capacities, or lack thereof. And in doing that, we overlook their knowledge and their skills. Why on earth wouldn't we bring the knowledge and insight of people who have used or have been impacted by unemployment into our planning around how we review it? For us, it's a no-brainer. But for the people that come on board, it also means that what has been or can be perceived as a difficulty, a horrible journey they've been through, whatever it might be, sometimes that can be perceived as a weakness, and they can feel like, services are trying to protect them. Whereas actually, why don't we flip that and see that as a strength and help them see that as a strength? The people who have been through some of the toughest stuff are some of the hardest, most amazing people you will ever meet, and their experiences become their strength rather than their vulnerability. So just very practically, how did that work? Well, Again, apologies to those of you who do this work all the time, but just some really basic practical pointers. We hosted the conversation in a community room for a local drugs and alcohol project, so it was very familiar for people who were living in that community rather than for us as professionals. We binned any sorts of PowerPoints. We didn't do complicated icebreakers. We just kept it very simple, getting to know you conversations in small groups. And we didn't have a big plan. And again, I said I'd be honest, part of that was I remember kind of just before going into the meeting room thinking, oh my God, I haven't actually really thought through what I'm going to do here. I think I spent sort of half an hour in the meeting room thinking, okay, these are the key questions we need to work through. But actually, and that was just because I was very busy, but actually it was brilliant because it meant that we were all kind of, although I was holding the space, we were all just muddling through together and we were working things out together. It just created a lot more informality. And we said what the opportunity was, that there was going to be this funding change, money was going to be coming into Fife, and we could maybe work differently, and we could think differently about how we were doing employability, and wouldn't this be amazing? And that was basically as far as we got. And we got people to think about what that might look like, how we might want to think about learning, what difference we would make. So this then turned into what eventually became a big engagement program. But there were a few sort of hurdles in the way, let's say. So again, lesson number 2, just please bring the service user perspective, whatever phrase you prefer, into your planning team as early as possible. It will make all the difference. So one of the first things we did, we met pretty much monthly from September 2019 to December 2019. And actually, I've realized I've forgotten to tell you, this is an important bit about the timings. So that policy was published in 2018, and then the kind of commitment to devolving the budget was published in 2019. And so in Fife, we were like, right, we've got to get ready for this. The budget wasn't going to come through until the financial year of 2021 to 2022, which seemed like quite a long way away. But I knew that that was actually going to hit us like a ton of bricks, because once you need to plan in your commissioning and your strategic work and so on and so forth, you need to start as early as you can. So we started planning for the delivery in 2021 in September of 2019. And the first thing we wanted to do was clarify our purpose, back to our beautiful HLS model. So this is the final version of the purpose. It got refined over the period of sort of a year. But our focus was to try and use the No One Left Behind funding as an opportunity to make sure that people were left behind were no longer being left behind and were getting the support they needed. And yeah, so that's this bit here, this purpose bit. And it was going great guns. So we had our meeting September to December. We planned our engagements. We knew how many people we wanted to work with, how we were going to run the sessions and everything. And then we knew we needed to get resources to make this work. So we spoke to the senior lead on the Opportunities 5 partnership. And he said, look, we'll get stakeholder buy-in. We'll run a workshop in February. So we had this workshop in February of 2020. People from our core planning team came along, including lived experience volunteers as equal participants, talked about how things were and weren't working, got people's ideas, and they bought into this engagement, this wider engagement journey to try and understand the problem properly and then come up with a real shift in our solutions. And they said, yes, we'll give you some money. But what happened in March 2020? Yes, COVID hit and everything went on hold. And there was this great big kind of pause as we all experienced that kind of massive cognitive dissonance and what on earth was happening, and left our offices and worked from home and just restructured our experience of the world, really. And then 3 weeks passed, didn't it? And it wasn't just for 3 weeks, and we realized that this was going to be an ongoing experience of working from home, and there wasn't going to be a kind of sudden leap back to normal. But our deadline for having commissioning in place and services in place wasn't changing. So we kind of picked ourselves up, dusted ourselves off, refreshed our steering group, and got cracking. And I think it's worth saying that the short time frames for the next phase were very challenging in some ways, but also actually very positive volunteers. They really liked the pace of engagement, especially because they were trapped at home during lockdown. So I guess my lesson number 3 is keep an eye on the budget timeline. It is no good doing a fantastic piece of engagement and human learning systems and co-production work if you miss the deadline for when the funding decisions need to be made. So just always kind of, and that's something I'm kind of quite good at. I needed other people on the team for the other bits, but that was important. So that meant for us, we needed to complete the whole engagement, consultation, and analysis journey before September. And by now we were in sort of late April, I think. So we refreshed our core team. So I've got to be honest, this was a coalition of the willing rather than a hand-picked crack team. It was just who was around and who was up for it. Some people left, some new people joined. Particularly, we worked with Fife Centre for Qualities, and they were really important in doing accessibility training for us on how to run online accessible sessions, rather than having our lovely community sessions we had been planning. And they also supported equalities monitoring and helped us engage with some of the hard to reach groups. We met weekly at this point, and we did a lot of work to build the conditions of trust, honesty within our core team so that we could tell each other what was and wasn't working, and also be honest about what we were learning and when we disagreed. So that was really critical. People said that the shared learning and the sense of us being a whole team was really important. This is the list at the bottom there of who became the core team. And it was about looking at the list that, it was about 50-50 people who use services or had used services or might want to use services, and people who worked in the sector. It was quite a big team. I would say keep your core group small, but really focus on building the conditions for collaboration and dialogue, because that is one of your most important learning spaces. So the wider engagement matters, but that core group is critical. So then we moved into the understanding the system bit. So that's what our wider engagement was about. We were trying to understand, who were the actors and factors, what were the problems and where were the challenges, so that we could then start coming up with new thoughts around solutions. So we did a bit of very basic stakeholder mapping. There's a lovely tool called a stakeholder needs analysis, which we don't have time to go into now, but is very useful. The people in the colored boxes, those were all on our core team, and the other voices and perspectives, we tried to ensure we connected with them via our engagement work. I would say employers probably were the least well engaged with here down at the bottom, but pretty much everyone else we managed to sort of touch in with. And we shifted to online. So obviously we had to shift to an online engagement experience. And that looked like this. So we used, and I mean very loose appreciative inquiry structure. I think I'm probably not using that phrase fully correctly, but for us that was about asking questions in a way which help people look at what's working and what could be better, and focusing on our own individual experience, rather than sort of sometimes in these contexts people talk about what they need and what they do that's difficult, and we tried to kind of center it on our personal experience when we were getting into discussion groups. So that's how we structured our conversations. We did 8 targeted conversations with people from particular communities that we thought probably wouldn't feel confident coming into more collaborative spaces. And then we ran 7 conversations focused on the 7 different localities in Fife. We also recognized that not everybody would want to come to an online conversation. So we had a survey, and really importantly, that survey was targeted at staff, people who use services, might want to use services, employers, and so on. But it also included the capacity to complete it for someone. So if somebody was not digitally competent or confident, they could ask a worker to complete it for them, and that was used. Overall, we had about 120 participants at our different workshops and 122 people completing the survey, which given the timeframes was pretty good going. And we did equalities monitoring on all of it, and I'll come back to that, but for us that was a really important part of what we did. Okay. So when we're going into these engagements and these conversations, it's really important when we remember that we're working with humans, that we think about psychological safety. So we had psychological safety within our core team because we'd been working together for a long period of time by now, and quite frequently. And we wanted to create a sense of psychological safety in the sessions that we ran as well. So we did a few things to try and help that. So first of all, when we were reaching those key perspectives, the people that we thought would be easier to ignore or maybe not want to share very sensitive information in those bigger conversations, we worked with trusted partners. So for us, that were things like organizations like Pink Salter, who work with people from the LGBTQ plus community, Fife International Forum to understand ethnic minority people's perspectives and migrants in particular, and Clued Up for accessing and getting the points of view of people who are affected by drugs and alcohol use. So that was we went to kind of where they were rather than asking them to come to us. And we did rely on Fife Centre for Equalities to bridge some of those relationships, because whilst we had relationships with some organisations, we didn't with all. And, why would they let us in? So that was really important. For all the sessions that we ran, we sent out pre-session information sheets with just very plain language, explanation of what we were doing. And it included the questions we would be asking and also the ground rules that would guide the session. And again, that was important to help people who might feel more comfortable having done a little bit of thinking or prep beforehand. And again, having that core team with all those voices meant we could make sure that it was as plain language as possible. We had ground rules, which I'll come on to. We totally avoided complicated tech. There were no Miro boards, no whiteboards, no PowerPoints again, any of that, super simple, using that appreciative sort of person-centered inquiry. And critically, our facilitation for every session included one person who was kind of in a professional capacity, if you like, and one person who was a lived experience volunteer, recognizing that sometimes people might fit dual spaces, but always there was one volunteer and one paid member of staff. I would be totally honest, I would be lying to you if I didn't say that mostly it was the paid staff that did the facilitation, because it was really tricky. But there was always time to reflect together, and the lived experience participants helped. They would sort of ask questions or share stuff, which would then help other people open up within the conversation. So it was really, really important having them there. So yes, lesson number 5, work with trusted partners to reach certain perspectives. So I'm going to drill in a little bit to some of these practical things that we did. So these were our ground rules. I thought it was quite nice to share. For those of you that aren't from Scotland, Nae Hygienes means kind of none of the top, well, it's not none of the top brass in the room, but don't wear your top brass in the room. So they were very, very welcome, but we wanted them to kind of put that aside in terms of their power and be part of the whole group. We also wanted to emphasize that it was okay to disagree, that actually understanding and listening to different people's perspectives was really important, and that also people didn't need to share, and it's okay just to rock up and be silent. This was a big learning piece for me, because I used to think everybody had to speak, otherwise, what was the point of them being there? But actually what we saw over the journey was that somebody might not speak in session 1, and this was true of our volunteers, but by session 3 they were really chipping in and they had so much to offer. Sometimes people need to be in the room a little bit before they might actually, at a future event, future collaboration, somewhere completely different, even nothing to do with your project, they might suddenly find their voice. So yeah, it's okay to be in the room and be silent. A few kind of, again, honesty alerts on this. Firstly, ground rules are great, but really important is the facilitation and making participants stick to them and holding them to that. So there were definitely some moments where I didn't do that very well. Maybe staff were particularly keen, they're very passionate about their service, and they just wanted to tell everybody how brilliant it was. And that could dominate and take us away from the important conversation we wanted to have. Or I remember having one leader in who just kind of sat back and said, "Oh, I'm just here to listen. I'm not here to contribute," which obviously wasn't what we were aiming for. We wanted everybody discussing and working together. So yeah, so I think facilitation is really critical. And I think the other thing I want to say is we really wanted to have collaborative conversations for the geographical ones. And when I say that, what I mean is we bring in staff as well as people who are using services, as well as leaders, all into the same space, because we had a lot of insight from our previous work that when you do that, there's learning in the room. Everybody walks away with some learning. You know, you are genuinely creating a human learning system, because it's not just me as a facilitator or a researcher that's learning. It's the whole space. But the geographical conversations, I think because we were online, they did tend to be much more dominated by staff. And, you know, so that was a shame, but it didn't mean we didn't get good learning. I mentioned that we did a lot of equalities mapping. I'm not going to go through the detail, but I suppose this is just to show you what that looked like. A couple of things that really helped was, especially for the collaborative conversations, we had a 60% completion rate, which is amazing. And I think that's because we emphasized that the reason we were doing the monitoring was so that we could make sure we didn't miss any key voices. We wanted to make sure we had this balance in our responses. And so by completing the form, people were able to help us show that we had evidenced, you know, that their voice was in there. And we did reach a pretty good match with the demographics of Fife, although I would say on ethnic minority backgrounds and so on, you know, not so good. But we did our best, and we were able to evidence who was missing and why. The other thing we tracked was the perspectives that people were coming from. So whether they were there as a service user or someone who might want to use services or had used them in the past, or whether they worked in the sector. So the blue line is the people that worked in the sector. And what this shows is, as I've said, that in the equalities conversations, those targeted conversations, generally we had a greater balance of people in the kind of using services, wanting to use services space, and the staff were fewer. But when we got to the geographical conversations, the staff perspective really dominated. And COVID wasn't all bad from our perspective. There was a lot, because we were all just muddling in together. You know, we'd never used Zoom before, we'd never done online sessions before, none of us, we were just muddling through together, and it created a real sense of team. And that was fantastic. It took away all those potential perceived power hierarchies from the core team. Online engagements were also easier for people who had social anxiety. So I think although we lost some people who were digitally less comfortable, we did gain some participants who actually felt more comfortable in online settings. And from the core team perspective, there was more time to support a very focused bit of engagement. And for those of us on the core team, I think it really did give us a sense of purpose and community at a time which was very difficult. One of the participants, I remember him saying, you know, he didn't know what would have happened if we hadn't had that project where we were all learning and working together. You know, he said, I don't know if I'd have survived it. So I think that was an amazing benefit that we got, because people were really up for being part of it and getting involved and getting stuck in. So back to our timeline. So we started back in September 2019. We had a big pause, and then we did all of our engagements events really basically over a 2-month period, and our survey was very, very intense. And then we needed to analyze our data. So we had run shared reflection sessions after every single workshop, where the host, the note taker, would sit down and sort of talk about what they'd heard, and those notes that they made got added to the notes from the actual session. But we did have a lot of data, 120 people, you know, 14, 15 conversations and 122 survey responses, and we had a time frame. So the honest truth is that when it came to the analysis, I did do a lot of the legwork. I did a loose thematic analysis, and I presented that back to the core team and got them to give me some feedback and help me refine that. But, you know, there was a lot of the learning that sat, or the analysis of the learning that sat with me. So yeah. And then once I'd kind of got the feedback from the core team, I refined what I was presenting, and then we had a big workshop online again, because we were still in that space, We presented the findings to the board, but also to a wider strategic audience. And I'll come on to what they were in a minute. But then we had to very rapidly start work on the commissioning framework, and a lot of the other learning points had to get pushed back. And some we never managed to progress, but a lot we did. So again, just trying to loop this back to that complicated diagram, you could say that this bit we spent a lot of time on, but when it came to co-designing actually what the commissioning framework was going to look like, there were only a small parts where we were able to do that. I did what I could. So the two things that we did do was we checked our commissioning framework back with providers before it went live. That was very important. I'll show we worked on some principles which informed the commissioning with people who were using services. So those were really important. But the rest of it, to be honest, was in there. And then we've kind of moved into the rest of the cycle. But I suppose for me, that's back to this lesson number 6 with a typo. Be practical and pragmatic about what you can achieve. So others might disagree with me on this, but for me, there's no such thing as perfect when you're doing this work. We are all doing our best within the constraints available, within the mountain, within the reality of the territory that we're navigating. We have our map, and then we engage with reality, and everything changes. So just be honest, be realistic. You know, it is far better, I think, to do something towards working in this way than to say, oh, there's no point doing anything because we can't do it all. It's back to the start where you are and do what you can idea, really. And every time we do this, we learn something more, we grow our evidence, and we do it better next time. Okay, so I think I'm going to very quickly rattle through this because I've realized we've got 20 minutes left. So was it worth it? So first of all, complicated versus complex. One of the things that we were able to evidence was that employability had traditionally been funded as though it was a complicated thing, this linear, if X, pipeline journey, you put in input X, Y, and Z, and out comes an employable person. But actually, it is much more like, it's much more complex, much more like a CLAT, something which is always changing and responding to its internal, external context. So I've put the link to the Cat and the Clock podcast, which if you haven't listened to it, I just highly recommend. I won't go into the detail of it right now, but this is what it looks like in an employability world. So in employability, there is what's going on for the individual, their internal context, their motivation, determination, confidence, their resilience, and their abilities. And then there is their external context, the economy, what job opportunities are available to them. Stigma and discrimination in the workplace, a massive issue for many people who are furthest from the labour market. They can be as employable as they like, but if an employer doesn't want to employ them, what are you going to do about it? And so on. So what we got was evidence that this complexity was real and that we needed to really factor that into how we were planning, commissioning, and delivering our services. So, for example, if you've got this complex world going on around employability, then you understand that every single person's journey to work is going to be unique because their internal and external context will be subtly, differently unique. But we rarely invest in the skills of our frontline staff to help people to navigate that complexity. We tend to kind of think of it as just come in, fix this problem, and off they go, solved, and that they will somehow navigate all of these external bits. And we fund services as though employability is all about the individual and never about these external issues. So we needed to think differently. We needed to understand that what works in one place will not necessarily work in another, or what works for one person will not necessarily work for the next, and just be an awful lot more adaptable. And as a strategic board, we need to think about these wider contexts as well. The other thing we learn is that for people who are using services, employability isn't just about a job, it's about a whole load of other stuff. It's about reaching your full potential, about skills, about a sense of purpose and being able to contribute, being a good role model for your family, something which is much more about human flourishing than maybe just getting somebody into whatever is the first job that is available. And we could evidence this. That was really critical. So how do you get people on board? You evidence it. And if getting a job is about human flourishing, and if people's journeys to work are complex rather than complicated, and they've got to navigate all of this stuff themselves once they've left your service, what actually matters is that they leave your service feeling like they've been heard, treated as an equal, empowered to navigate their own future, not fixed or judged. And people did talk about feeling fixed or judged in the existing system. So this was a really important thing, and also not feeling time pressured. So we ended up developing some principles which guided our commissioning process and helped us think differently. So these were co-produced, and these are still in play in Fife, and they inform all employability funded provision now. And we bids proposals for delivery are assessed against them, and performance is also considered in the round of these principles. They are super, super important. How we deliver services, I would say in any context, is far more important than what. And again, that's human learning systems, isn't it? It's all about humans. So our commissioning goal changed. So rather than being about fixing people and getting people into jobs, it was about allowing services to adapt and to the internal or individual needs of the people they're working with, but also to adapt to the external context within which they're working. So a much more flexible approach. I'm nearly there. So some of the things that changed. So I've talked a bit about the commissioning. We moved from commissioning based on numbers and targets to commissioning based on quality of services. And we also created a lived experience panel to help us assess those bids. So rather than it just being professional and partners only, we really understood that you need the voice and the perspective of people impacted by services in that assessment process, because they have a different lens on things. We shifted how we thought about the service delivery as well. So we really thought about the training element and the importance of having reflective practice built into frontline delivery. So we also invested in training for staff, no matter what provider they were with, in things like solution-focused working and employment law and understanding equalities, so that they could embody this work in their relationships on the ground. And then finally, strategically, we realized we had no voice of experience on our oversight and scrutiny, so we created a paid role for lived experience representation. We changed how we monitored performance from kind of like numbers in, numbers out, to something which was much more about learning what's working, what isn't, where are the problems, what are the numbers telling us, rather than and what might we do differently. It was an important kind of mindset shift. That, I would say, took several years to kick in, and also the governance on a performance management basis. So if you were to look at our cycle, we spent, we did this piece of work in 2020, and then we've got delivery happening, and then there is a lot of this still ongoing around how we think about our governance, but also how we encourage our providers to feel comfortable to experiment and explore as well. And we shifted the function of the contract manager to one which was much more about system stewardship and understanding what the blockers were for the providers in the system and how to get everything working better together. I think an important point on this slide is just the last point. 4 people have changed jobs since we did that work. So there's myself, moved into a national role, the LEP manager, the partnership manager, our lived experience representative, and the head of economic development. And that can create a real sense of risk around whether or not this kind of more collaborative, more learning oriented approach to working is going to continue or not. So yeah, so that's something that hopefully with continued training and we got enough people on board with that learning together, it will, but you never know. This is how it connected to HLS. And final points. I think really for me, helping people from different perspectives explore an issue together is really critical, because no matter what else happens, there is insight in the room. Be prepared to fail and learn, and stay curious, because that's the only thing you can do. Okay, I'm going to move on to pausing for questions. I think we've not got much time. So when Abby said we'd have an hour and a half, I was like, there's no way I can talk for that long, but guess what? So again, just any questions, any key points or reflections, just check in the chat. Oh, somebody's asked for the link to the stakeholder needs analysis. I could send that to Abby and she can share it out with the PowerPoint. It's a really simple document. And if you've got any questions, you can just come back to me directly. I've put my name and my email in the chat, sorry, in the PowerPoint. Yeah, Rachel's saying it's difficult to move away from new public management when the system is focusing on data and outcomes. And I absolutely agree. And in employability, it still does massively. I think we have to just find the spaces to continue to keep encouraging shifts. The more we can show, it's not about throwing out the data. It's about thinking, oh, thank you, Lynn. It's just a nice message from Lynn in the chat. It's lovely to see you there. I hadn't spotted. Yay. But yeah, so I think acknowledging and politically, they need the numbers, right? So politically acknowledging that numbers matter is important, but just trying to shift how we work with them so we're moving towards more of a curious stance is probably just a small but subtle shift that's worth being able to do. So we don't throw the data out, we just try and practice a little more curiosity about what is showing us. Any other hands up or questions? Because I kind of rattled through there at the end. Yes. Have we found out that applying HLS actually gets you better numbers out? Really good question. Really good question. So I wouldn't say yes. And the reason for that is because actually we're focusing on people who are further from the labour market. And that is a challenge politically, because politically they want us to be able to say, look, if we work in this way, you're going to get better numbers. But the reality is the No One Left Behind model asks us to work with people who are further from the labour market, and taking a human learning systems approach to how we think about doing that guides us towards working differently and with people who are furthest from the labour market. The numbers in, numbers out model encourages providers to work with people who are easiest to help and get them into any job. So you can get better numbers, but you might not be working with the people you want to work. Or I think someone used the phrase, can meet the target but miss the mark. So it's entirely possible to kind of get better numbers, but it's very hard to do that and actually do the thing that we're being commissioned to do in the world of employability, which is support people who are further from the labour market. So yeah, I think, and that is going to be a challenge. Realistically, that is a challenge, without a doubt. Yeah. Any other questions or reflections? There are no daft questions as per my ground rule slide. It can be as idiotic as you like. One of my favorite questions, I'm just going to share this with you. Oh yeah, do you track or measure impact on scale as part of HLS versus numbers out? Well, so I've moved on from Fife now, so I'm working nationally. I think it might be within Lynn's purview going forward, who's on this call, which is lovely. Yeah, and also I think back to this thing, do you remember what I said about the model? So whilst we have moved to this kind of human learning system mentality, nobody's jumping up and down and saying, oh, we're doing a human learning systems model yet. So even that, I don't think we would be able to say, oh, we've compared HLS to what we were doing before. What we might be able to say is what's different about how we are planning, overseeing and governing and delivering services in Fife, what feels different, and what difference are we seeing in terms of the challenges that people are facing when they're coming in. We could look at that, but it wouldn't kind of be a direct pre-post comparison. I'm actually going to a session on ripple effect mapping after this, which I think, as I gather it, is a really interesting tool for capturing some of the kind of impact of this way of working, which is different to and moves us away from just looking at the simple hard numbers, but kind of looks at some of the more subtle relational shifts that might be happening within a system. Because again, if we just stay with the numbers, we get stuck with the numbers. We need to start thinking about measuring different things. Amy, I don't know if the recording is going to get shared. Sorry, not Amy, Abby. I'm having name dyslexia this morning.
Yes, we will be sharing the recording.
Brilliant. Thanks,
in the
Abby.
slides, and also the stakeholder mapping link as well. And anything else anyone wants to request in the chat, then just pop it in.
So there are two questions about buy-in and supporting anxious managers and leaders. Yes. So I think a couple of really important things. Buy-in, I think the seeing through doing is really critical. So so do a small project, show what difference it can make, and bring that to your leaders, bring that to a strategic board. Remember that they're humans too, and they have, you know, a lot of stuff on. So working with them as though they're humans is really critical. In terms of anxious managers, leaders, and commissions, yes, anxiety is a massive, massive issue. I spent a lot of time sort of beyond this project, but in wider work we did on co-production in Fife, working with leaders to help them in the context that I was working in, to help them feel more confident about this, to talk about things you would put in place. So I think, yeah, thanks, Imka. That is a complex question at the last minute, but actually this is a really important thing. So to take an example of a project, a steering group which wanted to bring lived experience voices into the steering groups around trauma-informed work, and they knew that they were missing the perspective of people who were impacted by trauma in their group. And they wanted to do it, but they didn't know how. There was a lot of anxiety in the room. So the first thing we did was actually run a session for the current steering group to explore what the fears and hopes might be of doing that work, and just get that out. Get that out, because I think sometimes staff don't want to express their fears because they feel like they're going to be judged. So just doing that, but doing it in small groups, in safe spaces, and then working through what needed to be in place to look after those fears, because sometimes those fears come from very genuine past experiences. And then we did a lot of work around changing how the meetings were structured. We did work with the people that were going to come in, and actually even some one-to-one calls with those staff who had expressed particular concerns, just to make sure we could understand what was going on for them. So I think just treating people with kindness, wherever they are within the circle and system, is a really, really important thing to do. And then thinking about how you open meetings, you know, just stupid stuff, but honestly it's surprising how often it's forgotten. Opening meetings with your ground rules, making sure your chair understands how to do that in a friendly way, helping, yeah. And then the learning is through the doing. So when we did the work on mental health, latterly mental health and community context, there was so much fear by mental health workers around how to, oh my God, you're going to bring in these former mental health patients into our discussion space. What's going to happen? It's going to be a disaster. And then we did some work and we brought them in, and it was amazing. And very rapidly, it just wasn't an issue. You know, they were just other people in the team, just like everyone else. Did I have a method or template for capturing the AI conversations? Yes. Do I still have that? No. But yes, we did for all the conversations. I think we had our core questions, and then we had a basic template that we asked people to fill, who were the note takers. And then it was thematic analysis all the way. So it was quite loose. It was quite expansive. But yeah. Yeah, no, I completely agree. Imka, have you vanished? I think Imka's vanished, but just popped in saying we're struggling with that. Yeah, I think so. Okay. Okay, are there any other questions? If not, I think I'm going to very quickly share one last slide, which is just a QR code. So we've lost a few people, but hang on if I can do that right. I think there is a request or an invitation, if you found this useful, to donate a little bit to the Human Learning Systems Collaborative, because it can't be done for free. You can do that via this QR code, and I think if Abby can pop the link in the chat as well, that would be super helpful.